Hello, everyone. I am Gabrielle Dolan, and we are live on the couch. Well, not actually a couch. I think we're both at our respective desks, but I have Zoe Daniel with me. Welcome, Zoe.
Hi, Ral. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good for you to join me on the virtual couch. Now, I should let everyone know that we are live. So if you have a question, just put it in and we will come to your question. We probably may not get to all of them, but I'll try to get to as many questions that come through. I should also say that we met. I think, Zoe, we would have met maybe, I don't know, 5 years ago, and we're both members of the International Women's Forum. So we met through the Victorian chapter of that. So I have followed your career well. And one of the things I did want to talk about is that you wrote a book a couple of years ago called Trumpland. And I read the book and I love the book. And the reason you wrote it because you were one of the very few journalists. Well, actually, maybe let me not tell you. You explain why you wrote the book. Why you wrote the book.
Well, I wrote a book on Donald Trump, and really the book's kind of more about Donald Trump's supporters and why they support him after covering the Trump administration and the election of Donald Trump as a journalist for the ABC. And I think that I felt that there was a missing piece in the conversation about Donald Trump, that, people assumed a lot of things about who Donald Trump's supporters were or are and why they support him. And because I spent basically 4 years or so interviewing and interacting with and hanging out with Donald Trump supporters, and I realized that they're a lot more nuanced than people might assume. So there was that part, and I think I sort of wanted to try to help people to understand the loss of hope in the inland states of America, particularly, and the fact that people were sort of looking for an outlier and a disruptor to try to change something. So they perhaps put their faith in Barack Obama in some cases and then flipped to Donald Trump, which seems very counterintuitive, but that is what happened for some people. But also to take a look at that fragmentation of trust and democracy in the US and just what's driving that in various ways, which it's funny sitting in the position that I am now as a political candidate, that's one of the driving reasons for me, that real concern about that fragmentation of trust in leadership and the fact that there's sort of this polarization of the community and their government, which I think is quite dangerous. So the book sort of takes you through various moments in the Trump administration and brings it all together in a way that I think people can see a thread that runs through Donald Trump's strategy and also how he mobilized people behind him in various ways.
I loved reading the book, and you're right. It was you were one of the people that were thinking, because you had been speaking to all his supporters, going, I think he's going to win this. And I know a lot of people, including myself, would be sit there and go, why would anyone vote for him? But yeah, the book was a real insight as to, they didn't necessarily agree with everything he was saying, but thought they would be better off under him. And some had voted for Obama beforehand and switched to Trump. And so I love the fact that you actually took the time and went out and listened to all them without and it was what I felt, it was truly without judgment, to capture why they were, why they were part of Trumpland, I guess, as the title said. And I was going to ask you, so I'm glad you got onto this, is any similarities? Because, that fragmentation of the lack of trust, but do you see any similarities now in the position you're in running as an independent?
I do. I see a lot of similarities. I mean, look, the Australian political system is obviously quite different to the United States, and this is not a presidential election campaign that we're sitting amid. But I still see the deployment of Trumpian tactics by our politicians in some ways. So the use of gaslighting, the use of the term fake news as a cover for inconvenient truths, and sort of on the other side, from the voter perspective, that real erosion of trust in leadership. If there's one umbrella issue that I've been seeing when I've been talking to people over the last 5 or 6 months, is this sense of lack of accountability and lack of honesty from politicians, and a sense of us and them. You know, there's one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. So, and also the fact that even during the pandemic, you saw people sort of gravitating towards conspiracy theories and the sort of echo chamber of a particular type of media that might feed their pre-existing biases rather than sort of taking in a variety of opinions and perspectives. So I think all those sorts of things feed that concern that I have, that if the public or the community don't have trust in government, democracy, and the system, it's very different to then lead that community and to implement policy to benefit that community when people are sort of arguing about whether the sky's blue and whether the world's round, because facts have kind of become a matter of opinion for a lot of people rather than being binary. And I think that's really concerning.
There's been, there's been a lot of research by Edelman, yeah, that do research every year, and they monitor trust both in political and business, and there's two other areas, and it's businesses, right? Like, people have more faith or trust in business and corporates than they do in their political leaders, and this is a worldwide survey, and it just goes to show that how trust is so important. Like, with the people we work for in business, or with who we deal with, and it does seem to be there seems to be a real lack of trust in our political systems at the moment, and that does seem to be sort of a bit worldwide, or at least in Australia and America, from what I can see.
Well, I feel that there's different levels of accountability in the corporate environment. And I think that in the seat that I'm standing in Goldstein, there's a lot of people who are very senior in business, for example, so have to adhere to a particular set of standards in their corporate life. And I think that if you consider perhaps two of the main platforms that I'm standing on, which are climate and gender equality, you've seen the corporate world moving much faster than government on those two things. And then the other part of my platform, apart from economy and prosperity, is integrity, and that goes to accountability. But, if you consider climate and gender equality, you've seen the corporate world start to really step into that space and take affirmative action in many ways in response to the market, in response to the demands of their customers. And yet, if for politicians or our leaders, the market is the community, they're not listening to the community. If you consider on climate, for example, 75 to 80% of the community of Goldstein want faster, better and more economically focused action on climate change, yet that's not the representation that we get as a community. So that feeds a lot of frustration among people who feel that their views aren't being considered.
You talked about a bit before about the fake news, and Trump made that phrase famous. Like, no one spoke about fake news until he made it sort of famous, and he would often, and it's not just him, it's almost like anything people disagree with, they just brush it off to go, well, that's fake news, and go, really, is it? I don't know, but everyone seems to use this term fake news. One of the things you want to focus on is the Integrity Commission. How did it feel? Like, how did it just feel personally when you've got some people calling the independents fake independents? How did you take that personally?
Yeah, as someone who's, I think, built a career on my integrity and honesty, and has really, held that as central to the way that I've practiced my journalism, having, especially in an environment where there's no truth in political advertising, and where people can make all sorts of false statements about me that really can't be rebutted or are difficult to rebut, that's very frustrating. And also, from a journalistic perspective, it's it's sort of anachronistic to everything that I'm about, because it's all about exposing the truth. Yet we're in an environment where leaflets can be dropped that are false, or sandwich boards can be placed outside polling booths saying fake independence or whatever, and that's legal. Yet as a journalist, I sort of think, well, surely the truth is fundamental to everything that we do, and especially the function of government. So it is hard to get your head around. And you realise too that once someone deploys false information, it's very hard to pull it back, because some people will always believe that. So the deployment of the false information, and this is, one thing that Trump was very good at in terms of seeding doubt, that's a lot easier than the rebuttal of that, because there will always be a portion of people that either won't believe the rebuttal or you can't reach. And that's why disinformation is so dangerous, but also such a powerful tool for those who seek to control societies with negative and false information. It's very dangerous.
You see that often in newspapers or TV shows, where it could be the front page news or the leading story, and they find out like it's wrong, whether deliberately or innocently it's wrong, and then the apology is like buried, on page 11 in the newspaper, or buried, and so no one ever, most people see the fake, well, the incorrect information, and very few people see the apology that it was wrong. So
well, it's also the context, I think, that, if I could just briefly pose one example. So one of the things that people have been raising with me a lot during the last 6 months is housing affordability. There's no doubt we have a housing crisis in this country. A lot of people can't afford to buy a house, but also renting is incredibly expensive, and this is really challenging for a lot of people. So a lot of people raise this with me. I think, as a genuine representative of the community, that's something that I should try to take forward in some way, to at least look at what's happening in the housing market. This is something that the major parties don't want to tackle, because it's hard, it's challenging, and they don't want to do anything that's difficult. So one of the things that I've posed in line with reviews that have been done, for example, in New South Wales by the Liberal government around housing affordability, is, let's have a look at the tax system, and within that have a look at housing affordability and what distortions there might be. I have no preconceived notion of what the outcome of such a review might be. I do think, though, that it's worth having the conversation, given that so many people are affected by this, a conversation that neither of the major parties will have. The fact that I've even put that on the table, or stuck my head up on that issue, has now been deployed into what I would call a fake news pamphlet that's been put into letterboxes, suggesting that I want to impose tax increases, land tax, and all sorts of things on the residents of Goldstein. Now, this is patently wrong. That's not what I'm proposing at all. I'm just saying we should have a conversation about something that's affecting a lot of people. This is sort of the twisting of information that happens, that I think is really negative, because it's then very difficult to get forward movement on policy areas that are hard and need to be tackled.
I actually find it astonishing that when it comes to political advertising, it doesn't have to be true. I think you sort of see, like, over the years, you see ads from either parties, and you sort of, they're throwing mud. But the fact that it can be blatantly like a lie and it's still okay, I find astonishing. And I don't even know how people even like take in this information to decide who to vote for. And I know this might be logistically hard, but surely we could have a way that everything that is around political advertising, it needs to go through some form of check to go, okay, that might be your opinion, but it's got to be some form of truth to it, or they should just go, no, that's actually incorrect, and not do it. And I don't. It just astounds me we can't do that.
Well, that's one of the specific policies that I have under my integrity policy, which is that we must have truth in political advertising. One of the classic ones doing the rounds at the moment is that the UAP is claiming that they can keep interest rates under 3% for the term of the government. Well, they have no control over that because interest rates are set independently by the Reserve Bank. So that is an outright falsehood. And the thing is that I don't think it is that logistically hard. It's the same thing that I said before, the corporate world having to adhere to one set of rules and the political world adhering to another. Why can corporate advertising be held to account for lying? I mean, you can't lie in corporate advertising. So I can't see why you should be able to lie in political advertising. And I actually think it's a loophole that can be quite easily closed. Perhaps the major parties haven't closed it because they see some advantage in it, but I think it's out of control.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I want to talk about just how you. I know you spent a lot of time deciding whether to run or not. So just like steering the conversation to a more personal angle from you, and if anyone's got questions around that, post them. But how, like, what was, I guess personally, what was the process you went through to decide to throw your hat in the ring? Were you approached? Did you just put your hand up? How long did it take? How involved did you speak to your family, your parents? Who else?
Well, I was asked to run by a community organisation called Voices of Goldstein. So they'd been formed in 2020, and it was a group of concerned residents that really wanted to see politics done differently. A few people put their hand up, and they were sort of going through a process of selecting a candidate. And they came to me through a friend and said, would you be interested in standing as an independent? I never would have run for either of the major parties. I'm not ideological in that sense. And I think having been a journalist for so long, I really sort of tried to be politically objective. And that's the reason that I don't, like, I see costs and benefits in the platforms of both the major parties. Initially, my response was absolutely no way. I've been around politics for so long, both in Australia and internationally. I know how toxic it can be, especially for women. I'd also spent, on and off the best part of the last 15 years being a foreign correspondent, spending a lot of time away from my family and my children from when they were very young. So we're finally back in Australia, sort of settled in spite of COVID. And so the idea of sort of jumping into something like this was a little bit of a challenge mentally. But I did think about it for about 2 months, and I realised that the pillar issues for the Voices movement, or the Voices of Goldstein group, of equality, integrity, climate, underpinning future prosperity with good climate policy, and several other things, really were in line with my priorities. And so I kind of worked through that, and then also spoke to my family about it a lot, because obviously if I'm elected, I'll spend a lot of time away from home. And it was really my now 15-year-old son who said to me, Mum, someone's got to do something for us. No one's doing anything. You've got an opportunity to do something. You've got the skills to do it. Someone's got to do it. And how will you feel in 20 years' time if everything's worse and you had an opportunity to do something and you didn't even try? So I thought about it a bit more, and then I decided, okay, I'll go through the process with the Voices group. And I was taking my son to footy training, and I said to him in the car, okay, I've agreed that I'll put my hand up. And he was cheering in the car. And I said, well, I haven't got the nomination yet. And he said, yeah, but the first step is saying yes. Which I think is just so interesting.
Your son sounds like he's got so much wisdom and insight.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, and also my children, like, they've spent so much time living overseas. I mean, that we've spent several years in Southeast Asia. We spent several years in the United States. My son's the older of my two children, and so therefore he has a worldview that's quite different, I think, to other kids of that age. And I do remember that when Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement in 2017, my son was putting his shoes on before school, and he was sitting on the bottom step at our house in Washington, and he just burst into tears. And I said, oh, what's wrong, bud? And he said, no one's doing anything the temperature is going to be too high, it'll be too late to pull it back, and no one's doing anything. And I recall feeling really helpless, thinking, well, okay, I can't really do anything about that. Off you go to school. And so that kind of came back to me in the process of considering taking this on. It would be much easier not to do it. Plainly, going into politics is a very challenging thing in various ways, especially Australian politics right now is quite nasty.
Yeah.
But he's right, someone has to do it.
Is he still cheering for you? Is he still I guess, yeah, I mean, you know, it's when you do enter politics, it's not only you're sort of by default bringing your family with you. Have the kids copped any flack, or, you know, are they loving the fact that, you know, I don't know, what are they feeling now in the heart of, in the, you know,
Yeah,
the mix of it?
I don't think they've copped flack as such. You know, there's been some, I would describe it, disinformation that's been spread around that's created some questions from their friends and parents of their friends that we've just managed in a really open, friendly and explanatory way. And the other kids and parents have been very generous as we've worked through that process. I think, you know, the kids have realised that it is quite demanding, and that you do get a lot of flack. And I think that there's been, especially for my son, there's been a development of a sense of, okay, I have to keep a lid on myself getting annoyed about things like defacing of signs, for example, or
Mm,
nasty things being said about me on social media or in the press. You know, he's just having to work through not reacting,
yeah,
which I think is a process for anyone. But, you know, as a journalist who's been in the public eye for a long time, I already knew how to do that because, you know, I've had to do that for a long time to some degree, or, you know, engage with people in a civil way and sort of agree to have civil disagreement, but agree to have a conversation. So, you know, I think that's a process for the kids to figure
yeah.
out.
You've talked about that one of the driving factors was, you know, you got clearly you got approached, and your family and your son, like, sort of, you know, said, let's do this. We've actually got a question from Keely. Thanks, Keely Keg. And he's asking, Zoe, what was the last thing Tim did? I'm assuming Tim is the current minister member. What was the last thing Tim did or did not do that made you go, that's it? We need to do something. We need to shake stuff up politically. Was there anything that he was doing or not doing that you were so in disagreement with that pushed you a bit towards this?
Mm. Yeah, look, I think the most recent example is not crossing the floor for trans children on the religious discrimination bill. I just That's a bill that I never would have voted for. And the reflection from people in the community was that they were not in favour of it either. And I think that, you know, without being personal towards Tim, because, you know, I know he's worked very hard for 6 years in the role, but to me, the whole point of the role is to reflect the views of your community and to try to articulate those and take those forward to the parliament. The problem with being a party politician is you can't do that because you have to vote along party lines, particularly as a minister. You know, he would have lost his job as a minister if he'd crossed the floor on that bill. So it makes you hamstrung. You know, I think in a broader context, and this goes to my frustration with the two-party system, is that in effect right now we have a hung parliament where the National Party has control of the parliament. And that means that although, as I said, we have 75 to 80% of people in Goldstein wanting faster climate action, we're, as an electorate, as like the rest of the country, beholden to the position of the National Party on carbon reduction targets and those sorts of things. So it's just to do with the views of the community not being reflected or taken forward by the local member because that person is hamstrung by party lines.
Mm. Has as you've gone through this campaign, has anything? I mean, you're a journalist, and you probably knew, like, I guess out of anyone, you probably knew what you were stepping into. But has anything surprised you, either positively or negatively? What's happened in the campaign towards, I guess, towards you personally or your campaign?
Yeah, so there's two answers to that, and I'll start with the negative, which is the smaller bit. Um, I knew it would be nasty and difficult, but the digging of dirt and the slinging of mud has been, in my mind, next level. Um, to the extent that, for example, I've had to upgrade my home security, and there have been moments where I've felt sort of, um, I don't know about threatened, but a little bit vulnerable in the physical context, and worried about the kids and, just how they might be affected if they were confronted by someone who was particularly worked up about me standing as an independent as part of as part of a democratic process, which sort of seems weird. But so that's been a little bit, well, quite substantially more than I thought it would be, even though I was prepared for things to be challenging in that regard. But just park that. The thing that has been most surprising about this is the level of community engagement in this campaign. It has been, in many ways, the most positive experience of my life. I know that I and the other campaign volunteers and team have made lifelong friends through this. There are thousands of supporters. There are 12 to 1,500 active volunteers, door knocking, leafleting, working in the campaign office, standing at pre-poll. People are so invested and have really come together for something that's quite different, because they want to make a statement as a community, and obviously not the whole community is on board. And I totally acknowledge that in a democratic process that people have differences of opinion, but it has just been the most beautiful thing to see. I mean, a group of the volunteers formed a choir and changed all sort of song lyrics to Zoe-ified lyrics, and they've been sort of performing around the traps. And my fridge and freezer are full of meals. I came home today from campaigning all day. There was an esky on my doorstep with notes from the volunteers who've cooked meals for me and my family to feed us through into the election, so that no one has to cook. People have been offering to pick up and drop off my kids at soccer or footy. And, so there is this, it's a collective effort that has just been absolutely wonderful and so uplifting and inspiring and energizing and exciting. People are genuinely optimistic. And I think we're largely staffed by volunteers who've never engaged with politics before. And that's a real change, I think.
Yeah, I'm actually just noticing that too with my friends and everyone, that people who weren't overly into politics are just really involved in this time. And I think why they're involved, and maybe I'll speak for myself personally, is I can sense a change, and I can sense a change in our political system, hopefully for the better. Hey, I did want to ask you a question, because well, I was going to say you were and a journalist most of your career. How have you found swapping over to the dark side or the good side, however you want to call it, the reaction from other journalists when they're interviewing you? Because I would imagine, well, I'm not going to imagine, like, does some treat you better because you're them and you're a mate, or do they think, oh, I don't want to be biased, so I go harder on you? How have you found a difference with being interviewed by journalists that in a lot of cases and have probably known for a long time?
Yeah, in some ways, I feel that I get a harder time from reporters because they expect me to be able to perform. And that, I'm not surprised by that. I was expecting that. I would say that, with respect to my former profession, that broadly I find the media's treatment of this election quite disappointing. We've seen these sort of gotcha moment questions and such, which I think is incredibly unproductive. But beyond that, I mean, as a so-called teal independent, and I use the phrase so-called sort of sarcastically, that it's become evident to me that the media is just as beholden to the two-party system as the two major parties are, that it's much easier for the media to kind of grapple with a two-horse race and to time their, Liberal candidate versus their Labor candidate so that they can make sure that they're getting even coverage. As someone who, in effect, is part of a movement that's disruptive, it's been quite clear to me that they just don't know how to box that disruption. So initially it was, this is just a sort of novelty show. And then as it became evident that independents might actually have an impact at this election, it's sort of become an exercise in trying to find something nefarious in what independents are trying to do, rather than just talking to communities about why they want independent representation. Because I was chosen by my community to take this on. It's not like I put myself forward for it. I was asked to do it because the community wanted politics done differently. So I think the question, and you're starting to see it asked a little bit more now, is why did the communities that have chosen independence go down that track? And what was influencing them, and what's wrong with our current political situation that motivated them to work, in my case, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 6 months virtually to get us to this point a week or so before an election.
Yeah, I think the deliberate gotcha questions by journalists this campaign. I don't know whether they were always there. I've just noticed them, but that's been a real disappointment. And I think there should have been an agreement by all people running to just say, if it's a deliberate gotcha question, say, I'm not going to answer it, whether they know it or not, just not answer it. And because and I reckon if the first someone, maybe it was maybe Scott Morrison should have led that, or Anthony Albanese, to just say, let's agree that when there's a deliberate gotcha question from a journalist, refuse to answer it even if you know the answer, because that would have stopped it. And they're just, sitting here as trying to decide, and I just find them so annoying, those gotcha questions, and they look just really bad on the journalist, not on the politician that couldn't answer it.
Yeah, I mean, I was asked on radio last night. It was kind of a pop quiz, but there was a question of, well, if Hawke or Howard was the question in the pop quiz. And it's a gotcha question because it's designed to alienate half of voters. So there's no right answer. But also the question doesn't go to the nuance of why I might answer it in a particular way. For example, I wasn't voting when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister. I hadn't turned 18. I grew up in Tasmania. When I first voted for John Howard was around the time of the Port Arthur massacre. So the gun buyback had a big influence on me. As a swinging voter, I then drifted away from Howard because of refugee policy. So I later voted Labor. But the thing is, in a gotcha question like that, where it's Hawke or Howard, you just have to answer Hawke or Howard. And no one listening knows what any of the background to that is. So, and then you have to ask the journalist or radio presenter, well, what was the point? Were you trying to put off half the population without giving any nuance to the answer? It's just very interesting process.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, so I was going to say that, we'll finish up in a couple of minutes. But the last few polls are showing that you are well and truly in the race. When you first went into this, did you sort of go, look, I'll give it a crack, let's see what happens? Or did you genuinely go, no, I'm going to win this? I mean, and you're probably not even going to answer that now. Are you surprised, I guess, how, like the recent polls, what do they show you winning, or very close to, or like it's so close that it's like it's an amazing result either way type thing?
Yeah. Well, so first part of the question, I definitely went into it with the intention of winning it, or attempting to win it, like giving it not going into something that I thought, well, we've got no chance of winning it. So before I finally agreed, I actually asked the Voices of group to do some polling so that we had a sense of whether there was a chance of winning the seat, and that showed that there was a chance of winning it. Obviously, from a standing start against a six-year incumbent in a safe Liberal seat that's never voted any other way, it was going to be challenging. But the campaign, I've been very lucky to have an amazing campaign team, staffed largely with volunteers and some paid staff who've had a great strategy on how to execute that. So I think my thinking is, even though the last several polls have looked quite positive and looked like I'm perhaps a nose in front, that it's going to be extremely tight. And I think that's what I was expecting when I saw that first polling way back in November, it would have been. So, although there's been some positive polling in the last few days and the polling certainly trending in the right direction, I wouldn't say I'm confident. With the team I've got, I'm really optimistic, and the feedback that I get from the booths, I'm really optimistic, but it could come down to just a handful of votes. I'm very prepared for it not to be announced on the night, for example. It could be tight enough that we have to wait for that. So in terms of the way we run the campaign now, it's just like boots on the ground. It's all about the ground game. And I've seen that in the US, so I know how that goes. So we've got, as I said, more than 1,000 people door knocking, leafleting at train stations, at pre-poll, phone banking. We're pulling everything out to just get in front of people and try to explain to people what the alternative is, that you don't have to vote the same way that you always have.
I saw something on the news last week, and I don't know where it was and at what level. I think it was like at council level, and the votes were exactly the same. So they tossed a coin to decide the winner. So hopefully it's not that close. But that would be, that would save us a whole lot of trouble, wouldn't it? We just toss the coin and see who wins. Hey, thanks, Zoe. I want to ask you one last question. Now, this is pretty personal, and we're going to go really deep here. But did you always like the color teal?
Oh, yes. And just briefly, right back at the beginning, there was like a 3-week conversation in my campaign team about what color to have, and it started getting beyond the ridiculous, because obviously you can't have blue, red, yellow, or green. You can't have black and white. Kathy McGowan's got orange, so that didn't really leave a lot of options.
You didn't want to go brown.
No, you didn't want to go brown. There's talk about dark purple, and I was a no on that. So in the end, after this going around in circles for about 3 weeks, I said my favorite color is teal, so we're just going with teal. So, and I said, this top doesn't have it, but I said we'll have a yellow accent because that's Goldstein. So some of the tops have got independent for Goldstein in yellow. And then it became apparent that several of the other independents also went for teal, and Zali Steggall has a variety of a version of teal, like a turquoise. And so now all of a sudden we're the teal independents, but that is the legit backstory of how we ended up with teal. Yeah.
Look, you've started a movement, the teal independence. I love the fact that they did all this research, and in the end you go, you know what, I just like teal, let's go with teal. But you are running out of colours on the the spectrum when you look at all the
and Zali says that I think I wasn't aware of this, because this was way before I came on the scene, but Zali, because I was overseas, but there's a thing about liberal, so sort of centrist liberal, if you like, with environmental priorities. So that's sort of how Zali had been characterized previously. So that's, I think, why the media has really tagged those independents who are running on that kind of platform as the teal independents.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks for your time, Zoe. All the best with the rest of the campaign, and we'll see what happens on the 21st, or as you've said, it might be so tight. We see what happens a few days later. So
Yeah.
thanks for being part of it.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks for having me.
Just going to end the broadcast now. Just figure out how to do